town boundary, and it's I think it started out as a farm stand.
Yeah, it's really old.
And it's the best produce options in the greater Boston area at really, really good prices. All right, we'll go one more minute since there's still kind of people trickling in, and then we'll get started. And Tori's not going to go for a full hour, so. But we can have the questions.
Are the questions going to at least take an hour?
Yep.
Depends on how engaged this audience is.
I'm working. These are phenomenal.
Yeah.
Tori, what street is this?
Say
that they're just screaming.
I know, right?
This is like a last minute decision.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, those are Boston records.
it's definitely in Boston.
It's back bay.
If I were another year, man, it's
But-
keep us to do it.
That would be contrary.
Fuck, I can't read.
What's happening?
Funny, just some literally just screaming.
Yeah, you went wild.
Randomly with a laser pointing up his there.
All right, well, why don't we get started? So thank you, everybody, for coming. You know, as an advisor, there are those really, awesome days, like when your PhD students graduate, or last day of classes, or days like this when, 2 years of working with my group. And I'm so excited that everybody came to hear about what she's been doing. I could not be more proud of what Victoria's accomplished and what's to come. So this is an almost done story, and we'll wrap it up this summer, but I'm getting ahead of myself. And I just wanted to point out that this is her baby. She designed and led all the field teams and pretty much did this from end to end. I helped maintain some sanity checks on the numbers, but this is her baby, and I am so proud. And with that, I'll stop. So this is Victoria Dearborn, not Victoria Drake. I sent a note to Josh right after the announcement went out, who's Victoria Drake? But Victoria Dearborn.
Okay, great. Well, thank you all for coming. This is a much larger turnout than I expected, but I'm glad you're here. I'm going to be talking to you all about my thesis presentation, which is the carbon dynamics of urban street trees. So, as a lot of you probably know, our cities are growing. Half the planet currently lives in cities, and it's expected that by 2050, 60% of the globe will live in cities, and currently urban areas are increasing by 67 million people per year. And in the United States, 80% of our population is currently urban. So urban ecology is an increasingly important field, and the need to understand our ecosystems and our trees is increasing in importance. So trees in hardwood forests and other forests have been pretty well understood for a long time now. We know what drives their growth, their mortality, and recruitment. But when you put trees in the city, it becomes an entirely different story. There are a bunch of factors that affect them, including increased CO2, increased nitrogen, increased aerosols and metals and ozone, the urban heat island effect, and increased ground space. And at the same time, they have decreased water infiltration and decreased root space. And so the combination of these factors is really difficult to get a handle on, and there's a lot of heterogeneity within cities for all these factors. It's not consistent across one city. But street trees are a really unique opportunity in understanding how carbon is moving through our systems, and also they're publicly managed, implanted, and maintained. So in terms of climate mitigation strategies and public policy related to carbon, they're a unique opportunity. And they're also, New York City and LA and Boston all have major tree planting efforts. Boston's began in 2007. It's called Grow Boston Greener, and the initiative was to plant 100,000 trees by 2020. And the main purpose of that was to increase canopy cover by 20% in the city to hopefully mitigate the urban heat island effect a little bit. But a secondary goal of it was to make street trees a carbon sink in Boston. And also, just a secondary note about this is that street trees are also, as are the demographics in the United States and across the world are shifting, street trees are an important resource as an access to green space for people. And so there's that added element as well.
What's that debate with that?
Yeah, I was just about to tell you guys, this is just one example of the bizarre nature of street trees. That's a carpeted street tree. This is just one of the many things that we saw that was super bizarre. And I can't explain it. I was guessing that maybe someone thought it would keep the water in or stop the erosion of the soil a little bit. I'm not entirely sure, but that was done by a local resident, not by the city.
It's a carpet over dirt, though.
It is a carpet over
It looks
dirt.
like asphalt.
I know, it does, yeah. Which is also a thing.
You
but-
find those.
Yeah, that also happens.
And you wonder how they'll survive.
Indeed you do. But they do survive, and in fact, they grow a lot faster than trees in forests. This is adapted from a study by Britt in the back there, where he was looking at how disturbance affects growth dynamics of trees. But the part that I want you guys to focus on here is this point up here, which is open-grown street trees, which are growing much faster than forested counterparts, and also areas of more moderate disturbance or more frequent disturbance. And the trees that we found, these were just red oak cores that he looked at, but they grew at approximately 0.9 centimeters per year, which I'll give you some context for later, but that's pretty fast. But we're missing a piece here. We're missing the mortality of these street trees, and we're missing information about the planting of these trees and how those two elements play into the carbon budget of the city as a whole. And so I had two hypotheses. One was that the biomass losses from street trees due to their mortality would outweigh the biomass gains through recruitment and growth. And just quick note, planting and recruitment I'll use interchangeably, but I mean planting. City plants trees are not naturally occurring. And then also there would be some significant relationship between these mortality and planting figures that we found and tree species, size, socioeconomic characteristics, and things like that. We thought we'd see some sort of pattern. Study area was Boston, beautiful town. It's got a humid continental climate, and it rains and snows 1,056 millimeters per year. The soils outside of the Boston limit are a standard silt loam, but that may not be true within the city proper. A lot of times disturbed soil within cities is a little bit different, so I don't have a firm handle on how the soil type itself is affecting these trees, but that's pretty heterogeneous anyway. It's not necessarily driving factor here. But the Massachusetts statistical area population is increasing at 1% per year. So in addition to cities growing around the world, our city is growing, and it's becoming increasingly important to understand it. So the methods my project was based on a survey that was done in 2006 that prefaced the Grow Boston Greener initiative. The city of Boston enlisted the Urban Ecology Institute, which is now defunct, to do a census of all the trees in Boston. So in the summers of 2005 and 2006, they measured a total of 38,756 trees in the city with 300 volunteers. About 30 of those volunteers were trained professionals, so scientists, arborists, people like that. And the rest were just people who wanted to volunteer, learned how to use a DBH tape, and went out into the field. And so just a quick note, I'm going to use a baseline here of 2006. So there's an 8-year interval between surveys. So for all of my time series analysis, that's what we're using. And then in 2014, I did a resurvey of these trees. And so if you look at these purple lines here overlaid, this is adapted from Steve Rossetti's paper in 2014, but these purple lines are the transects that I walked, and it's a total of about 70 kilometers throughout the city. And the way that I organized these transects are that I aggregated the Boston Redevelopment Authority neighborhoods into 10 neighborhood groups based roughly on their proximity, their per capita income, and their canopy cover, which is shown in that figure over there. And then with each transect, we just wanted to make sure that we had a balance of different city life aspects, and so there were main roads that were really highly trafficked, included quieter side streets that had a lot less traffic, and then also we wanted to make sure that there were at least 200 trees that had been surveyed previously that we could look at the mortality of improvement for. And so we measured a total of 3,500 individuals, which is approximately 10% of the initial survey, and we had 590 sample plots within all of those transects. And when I say sample plot, I mean one side of a city block. And I'll talk about afterwards what we consider to be the plantable space in that, which is what we use for area estimates, but one side of a city block. And 2-person teams walked everywhere. Me and some of the lovely people in the back of the room helped me with all of that.
Where do you decide, maybe you're going to say it here,
What's that?
how do you know where to put your measure?
Well, I'm going to tell you. Good question.
Okay.
So DBH, which you were
Hold
asking
it
about.
up right here.
No, it's fine. I like it. Keep it going. The diameter of breast height was measured at 1.37 meters off the ground. And so in our measurements, we would just tape our arms where that point was and then go from there. But yeah, so that's the standard that the UEI survey used as well. And then other things that we measured and the UEI survey measured, we looked at species name and common name. We identified them in the field. There were instances in both the UEI survey and our survey where trees were not able to be identified to the species level, only to the genus level. There were about 650 trees out of our 3,500 that were identified to the genus level. And so all of our analysis related to species and genus was done at the genus level. And then also, they had some estimates of tree height and canopy size and things like that to get an estimate of like Boston's canopy cover from the ground. And we didn't do that, but we also looked at the health, which was considered to be in good health if less than 10% of branches were dead, fair health if 10 to 30% were dead, and then poor health if greater than 30% of the branches were dead. And we added another factor to this as well that they didn't look at, which was a really qualitative assessment of pruning of the trees, where we would just say there was clearly no pruning, the tree was bushing out everywhere, or there was some sign of pruning where we saw clear cut marks, or there was extensive pruning. There were instances where all of the tree limbs were removed. And that was just kind of for our own edification. There's thoughts that pruning practices in cities may affect how correct our allometries are in predicting the biomass outputs based on DVH, but so those are the things we looked at. We also recorded latitude and longitude using a Garmin eTrex handheld GPS, and that's the primary thing that we use to match against the other survey. So the next step is matching. This was done manually, so I matched all 3,500 trees one by one with the information from the UEI survey. And if you look at this figure here, it's a little bit blurry, but these red points were imported into Google Earth. Those are the GPS coordinates for the UEI survey, and there's information attached to all of those. And through that and our GPS points, which aren't shown on there, we matched these trees. Another thing this figure really quick I want to talk about is this white strip here shows what we consider to be the plantable area, and that means the area in which the city could potentially put more trees. So in sidewalks, Boston has a minimum of about 3 feet. Usually it has to be larger, but the bare minimum is 3 feet space for walking. So it disincludes any of that space. And then also, obviously, if cars are coming in and out, you don't want to plant trees in front of that, so that's also disincluded. But those area estimates are used when we do stem density and things like that.
Sorry to interrupt that. Red dot, does that indicate the trees died or?
No, all of the points that we imported, I know, this
That
one,
one.
yeah.
Yeah.
All of those red points are just denoting that there was a tree in the UEI survey that was there. The color isn't significant for us.
No,
it's just,
but
yeah.
I mean, the fact that there's no tree now.
Right, yeah. So this one it was probably lost to mortality as opposed to that guy that was there. Yeah, good question, sorry, I didn't understand. But anyway, so then by matching them, we saw the ones that were present in the UEI survey that were not present now were considered to be lost to mortality. And those which were present in our survey that weren't in the previous survey we considered to be new planted recruits. And then we used a general hardwood allometric equation for the eastern US, which was kind of a bold choice, but we had over 150 genera in this study, and so to use individual allometries would have been really difficult, and also there is a lot of variability in how trees are growing, and so by using a general hardwood allometric equation, we kind of tried to exclude any bias that might be produced by different growth. And then also multiply by 50% to get kilograms per root.
What's DVH?
The DVH is that diameter of breast type, which we're measuring
Got
at 1.37 meters. Yeah. And then we just had a couple uncertainties.
But diameter, that's just, you mean circumference.
The way that the tapes work, it's actually will give you an estimate of the diameter, but you are measuring around.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I could show you one sometime. I'll show you how it works.
All right.
So there were a couple uncertainties that we dealt with in the study. We had 293 trees that had incomplete UEI entries, and so we removed those just to avoid any issues with that. We had multi-stem trees that were a little bit difficult to correct for just because multi-stem trees are usually regarded as separate trees, and in both surveys we regarded them as one tree, so we finagled with that a little bit. And then several statistical outliers we dealt with. So we had a total of about 311 trees, which we had correct biomass estimates for, but we did not include those in our growth estimates. We only included those in stem density and DVH estimates. So what do we find? The exciting part. This is just a figure of the DVH class in the bottom, so that's just like the range of DVH values, and the stem frequency, which is raw on the side, in 2006 and 2014. So this is just showing what our standing stocks are in size in the city. And there isn't any huge differences here except for the 10 to 15 centimeter category, in which we saw a dip from 2006 to 2014. Overall, that plantable area that I mentioned to you before was found to be approximately 236 meters squared, which is roughly like a 26 by 26 plot of land full of trees, but obviously more sparse. And the stem densities that we found were also not hugely different. In 2006, it was about 325 trees per hectare, or in 2014, it was about 335 trees per hectare. And for comparison there, Harvard Forest, which is a very similar composition to what we'd expect to be here if there wasn't a city, was about 594 trees per hectare in 2013. And the overall biomass, we found 11, more or less, kilograms carbon per meter squared, which is pretty high, but also keep in mind the area over which we're doing this is really small, and so what we're seeing in this number is that there's a lot of really large trees in a small fenced area that are accounting for a lot of biomass. But then there was a lot of variability in the plot level range, so those individual street blocks we saw between about 0 and 485 kilograms carbon per meter squared. And then in the neighborhood level range, those aggregated 10 neighborhoods, we saw a range of 4.75 to about 33.52 kilograms carbon per meter squared. And then again, for reference, Harvard Forest has about 12.7 kilograms carbon per meter squared, so not hugely different from what we found. Obviously, it's a little bit higher, but that's, again, an artifact of the size of which we're taking this measurement over. So showing the growth a little bit here, this shows the biomass change per DVH class. So the biomass that we're gaining through growth, not through planting at all yet. And you can see there's definitely some significant contributions in these mid-range trees, but these trees that are greater than 50 centimeters, between 50 and 150 approximately in DVH, we're contributing the most biomass, which makes sense. A little bit of change in a big tree equates to a lot of biomass. And the stem growth we saw in terms of diameter change again here is about 0.8 centimeters per year, and that's across all of the genera. And then the biomass change from that growth was approximately 14 kilograms carbon per tree per year and 0.27 kilograms carbon per meter squared per year. So breaking that down a little bit, Zelkova, which is a Japanese genera or genus, and the most common one in the city is Zelkova serrata, that's actually had our highest growth rate in terms of tree diameter growth. It was 1.36 centimeters per tree per year. And in trying to figure out why that was so high, it was a little bit unclear. They're not generally known to be a particularly fast-growing tree. They've been planted in the city a lot recently because they're a replacement for elm in terms of like canopy structure, and they're resistant to Dutch elm disease. And so it's possible that what we saw was that we caught these trees growing in their fastest period of growth in terms of diameter growth, not biomass growth. And that might be what we're seeing here, but not super clear. Pirates, which are the pear trees in the city, grew the slowest at about 0.6 centimeters per tree per year. And that's just the nature of their really delicate trees. You can see a lot of dead baby pear trees around this city that just couldn't stand the transplanting process. And then in neighborhoods, it was the slowest growth was found in Jamaica Plain Mission Hill at about 0.18 centimeters per tree per year, and the fastest was in West Roxbury at 0.7 centimeters per tree per year. To explain the Jamaica Plain thing really quickly, this is showing DVH class along the bottom again, in 2014 stem frequency and percent of total trees. And the gray here is the mean, and the orange is Jamaica Plain. And Jamaica Plain has way more trees in that really large tree category than the mean. And so when we see their slow diameter growth rate, that's probably a factor of this, where these large trees grow slowly in diameter. The biomass that they accumulate is a lot higher, but that's probably why we're seeing those rates there. And then when we tried to do the same analysis for West Roxbury and understand why West Roxbury was growing so quickly, again, it was not super clear. In terms of DVH distribution, West Roxbury has a mean DVH of approximately 35 centimeters, whereas the mean is about 30 centimeters, so not hugely different. The stem density is the second highest out of all the neighborhoods, but there's no clear correlation there either. And then in terms of income, it's about $39,000 per capita income in West Roxbury, which is just under the mean for Boston, which is about $40,000. So again, for this piece, we don't have a clear answer as to why it's happening that way, but we definitely found the highest growth rates in West Roxbury. So in terms of actual mortality, this is a mortality curve. These are pretty standard for trees that you see anywhere. DVH class along the bottom, and mortality in percent per year along the right there. And this is a pretty good sign that we see this. This is a standard U curve that happens in a lot of different tree populations where you'll have a lot of death in those early trees, though the mechanism behind this might be a little bit different for us. Our little trees have trouble being transplanted, whereas in forests, a lot of times young trees just have struggle to actually grow. And then we also see really high death in the really large trees. And I'll talk a little bit more about the mechanisms for that later, but that's also pretty standard. And overall, that point on the right there shows the mean mortality, which was about 2.28% per year which is actually pretty low for street trees, not super high. And the planting rate was pretty comparable at 3% per year. The change in stems that this equates to was we lost about 60 stems per hectare from mortality and gained about 44 trees per hectare through planting. But then the biomass implications of this, which is what all of our carbon is a lot more significant. We lose about 2.6 kilograms carbon per meter squared through mortality and only gain about 0.05 kilograms carbon per meter squared through planting. So we're losing a lot of biomass and we're not getting it back. And just quickly for reference, these are some growth curves from hardwood forests, eastern hardwood forests, and they show the same sort of general pattern. So that's pretty standard and comparable to forests, which is interesting. We'll talk about that a little bit later. This is just to reiterate what I said before. So this is showing deviation along the bottom here and stem density on the y-axis. And we can see that there's a lot of planting happening to the point where planting overall is pretty comparable in stems to the stems that we're losing through mortality. But when we bring biomass into the picture, the biomass that's being added to the system through that recruitment is really low and doesn't get even near with the biomass that we're losing through mortality. So to break down these results a little bit further, if we look at the different genera, these, along the x-axis here are the 10 most common genera in order of their frequency in the city right now. And these 10 common genera account for about 90% of the stems and 97% of total biomass in the city, which is pretty surprising. I would expect a little more heterogeneity there, but it is genera too, so multiple species within each of these. And Pyrus had the highest mortality rate at approximately 5.3% per year, which again, we talked about Pyrus a little bit before, it doesn't do too well in cities. And Venezia had the lowest mortality rate at 1.6% per year. But an interesting thing about this is that since the Grow Boston Commuter Initiative began, there have been some changes in the policies about which trees can be planted in the city. And these three genera are actually no longer planted in the city, which in terms of Pyrus is a really good thing. They're no longer planting pear trees, and so hopefully these mortality rates overall will decrease. But Fraxinus, which are our ash trees, and Platanus are also not being planted anymore. And then if we look at neighborhoods, this is a little bit confusing, sorry, but these are the neighborhood groups over here, and they correspond to the x-axis here. And you can see percent mortality and percent planting in each neighborhood. And overall, the planting and mortality on the individual neighborhood levels are pretty comparable. Hyde Park and Roslindale had the highest percent mortality at 4.3% per year, and South Boston and South Boston Waterfront had the lowest overall mortality at about 2.25% per year. But as I said, pretty comparable. Not huge significant results in here, but I'll talk a little bit more about the per capita income in these afterwards. But the biggest story here is that the growth actually makes up for a lot of the changes, a lot of the biomass losses from mortality. If we look at this, this is showing the net flux in kilograms carbon per meter squared per year for the different neighborhoods. We break pretty much even for all of these. The mean that we get is approximately negative 0.08 plus or minus 0.06 kilograms carbon per year. So it's essentially negligible. But keep in mind that this is after a lot of the tree planting has already happened, and so if that tree planting hadn't happened, would we be a carbon source? It's hard to know. Like, we're basically just reaching the bare minimum that we need to be with these trees in order for them to be a part of our climate mitigation strategies. For comparison, Harvard Forest has about 0.16 kilograms carbon per meter squared per year for their flux. So they definitely have a lot of forests that are young enough for our carbon sinks still. That's probably act later in life, it's a debate still, but that's one example. The most positive flux balance that we saw here was in Alston-Brighton at 0.17 kilograms carbon per meter squared. And then actually, the lowest does look like it's Jamaica Plain here, but again, I want to kind of count that one as an outlier because Jamaica Plain, if you remember, had a really high biomass distribution in the later DH category. And so any trees that are dying in Jamaica Plain will incur giant losses in terms of biomass and mortality. So that aside, the lowest balance here is in Mattapan at negative 0.2 kilograms carbon per meter squared. And so looking a little bit further at how the socioeconomic piece plays into these results that we're seeing, this figure is showing the colors represent per capita income along here, with blue being the lowest, red being highest. And then this is our street tree biomass that we measured. And for this analysis, we deaggregated the groups, so this is all of the Boston Redevelopment Authority neighborhoods here. And then along this axis is Receiving et al.'s biomass estimates using remote sensing techniques. And so we're looking to see here how much of our biomass is stored, or how much of the total biomass in neighborhoods is stored in street trees, and whether there's a socioeconomic component to this. And ultimately what we found is there really isn't a significant one. The p-value we got was about 0.24. But within that, there's still some elements that seem to have a strong relationship, like the Back Bay Beacon Hill area had approximately 10% of their total biomass in trees, and those are the two wealthiest areas in Boston. Whereas the Longwood Medical area and Roxbury, which have the lowest per capita income, were only about 1 to 2% biomass in trees. And so it seems like there might be some relationship, but again, statistically, there's not. This is just showing everything a little bit more advanced. Don't worry about all of it, but again, here's Back Bay Beacon Hill, and it has one of the highest biomasses in 2014 and the highest planting rate in the city. Whereas these lower socioeconomic areas of Mattapan and Roxbury are showing a lot lower planting rates, lower biomass. But there is a lot of variability in those mid-range neighborhoods. The neighborhoods that have kind of mid-range per capita income don't show a strong signal here, which I think is what we're seeing in our low p-value for the actual relationship. In terms of what this all means, like I said, our growth rate is actually pretty low. 2.28% is below what most of the literature has reported for mortality rates in cities, which range from about 3 to 10%. And that's still higher than typical hardwood forests, though, which usually are less than 1% mortality per year. So we're definitely experiencing elevated mortality, but it's not quite as high as we would expect to see. And some of the mechanisms behind this, there's a lot, and I don't want to dig too deeply into it, but they are different than are in forests. For example, a lot of trees get physically removed before they're actually dead. If someone doesn't like a tree, it'll be removed. It doesn't have to be anywhere near death. Any physical stressors, root space limitation, as I mentioned before, and impermeable soil conditions, which might be why there was that weird carpeted situation. Excessive pruning may affect tree health, and then difficulty of establishment of transplanted trees is something we definitely saw in the death of those young trees. But ultimately, the biomass loss from mortality is higher than that gain from planting, but our growth component here is kind of balancing us out right now. But what does that mean for the future? So Boston is really old, and our size distribution of our trees is pretty likely to be more similar to forests than that of other young urban centers. And the mortality that we see reflects that. For example, here is a figure of a mortality distribution in West Oakland, California, which has pretty new trees. They're pretty young. It's a recently established city in terms of like tree planting and everything like that. And their mortality rate for trees just greater than 24 centimeters, so really pretty tiny trees, was 0%. And granted, this is a small sample size, but still, it's definitely cities that have younger tree distributions are likely to see less mortality in large trees, which will mean less biomass losses through those trees. And so if the growth rates in this study are representative of cities with those small size distributions, may already be storing carbon. And Boston has the potential to store carbon as well, but it's going to be dependent a lot on street tree management practices. So really talking about that, most important thing is to maintain the planting of trees. As I showed you, we're just breaking even with this really intensive tree planting initiative. Remember, at the beginning, the entire UEI survey only measured about 40,000 trees, and so this initiative to plant 100,000 trees is a huge increase, and we're just breaking even. Fraxinus and Platanus were the ones with the lowest mortality in our study, and so it suggested that maybe those are the best species to be, or genera to be planted. But as I showed before, Platanus is no longer being planted in the city either. I'm not sure what drove that decision. A New York City study found that Platanus is actually the most cost-effective tree in terms of its survivorship, and then also its actual cost of transplanting. And existing tree maintenance and continued planting efforts will essentially determine whether Boston is a source or a sink. Those maintenance efforts of the mid-range DBH trees may be some of the most important parts of our management practices, because our age distribution is currently skewed towards old trees, and so as we continue to see those old trees dying off, we're going to have huge biomass losses, and it's going to be harder and harder to break even. But if we maintain those high, fast-growing, mid-range, low to mid-range DBH trees that determine that age distribution, it's possible that we could maintain ourselves as a net neutral situation or potentially become a carbon sink in our street trees. And so with the combined effects of that carbon storage, that's potential, can't be sure if it's going to happen or not, but those effects, as well as the reduced fossil fuel combustion due to mitigated urban heat island effects, street trees have potential to be extremely important in our neighborhoods. And again, it depends on our policy decisions though, so who knows what's going to happen. So this isn't a fully complete project yet, as Lucy mentioned. There's a couple things left. First of all, I'm going to graduate, and then I'm going to sleep. But then actually, the important thing, I'm going to fund the study to add a carbon box model to project future changes in the city. And hopefully that will give us a more complete picture of where Boston is headed with our street trees. And then also we're hoping to publish after all that. We're going to publish, not hoping to. We're going to. So yeah, that's my presentation. I just want to quickly say thank you to Lucy, who's been incredible for 2 years, and then all of my helpful fieldwork partners and data management partners who are all in the back there. But yeah, thank you. Feel free to berate me with questions. Yes, please.
What's the common name of the trees that are doing well? Low mortality.
Yeah, so
Platypus, or what is that?
Platinum Caesarifolia, I don't remember the common name of that one, I can look that up for you, but ash trees are also doing particularly well. Green ash and white ash are two of the species in particular that are doing very well. And then Floritia is the genera, that's honey locust trees, which if you walk down on like Newbury Street, those are entirely honey locusts.
There's a lot of lindens. How are they doing?
Yeah, they're doing pretty well. They were actually, that's the species name for the ones that we see, the little leaf linden is Tilia cordata. And that was in the 10 most, don't worry about it, but that was in the 10 most common genera. I can actually go back and show you. I know, I'm sorry, I signed different names. If I can find it, I'll show you. Yeah, so that one is this right here, which has a reasonably low mortality rate. It's not too bad compared to the rest. So yeah, those are a couple of them. Yeah.
I know we were talking about the socioeconomic factors behind the number of trees that were present in each area. Do you know who's in charge of planting them on a area basis?
Yeah, the city Parks and Rec department are the ones who currently are planting trees. I had personal correspondence with the guy who is in charge of picking every single tree that they plant in the city, Max Ford Diamond over in the Parks Department. And yeah, so what about them though? What are you curious about?
Because before you showed that there wasn't a very significant socioeconomic aspect to it. If there's a potential for if there's more open space in those areas, so I haven't been in those areas, so I don't imagine that there is a correlation to the rest of the rest of Boston. But maybe if the organizations who plant those trees were different, that could explain the deviation. But
yeah, well, all of these trees are actually planted by the city. The idea with street trees is that they're the publicly maintained trees. So they are planted by the city and they're going to continue to be planted by the city. But, I mean, part of the reason that we did the study was to help find out this information about where they're planted, And so they have some records of where they plant them, but I think seeing things like this will definitely benefit the city for sure.
The city's records are limited.
Yes. Yes. Try to work with them.
Along those lines, I was wondering if you could just articulate your a priori hypothesis for putting the socioeconomic parameters in your model for explaining this, because if planting is controlled by the city, you wouldn't have expected, or maybe, I don't know, I can't tell if you expected that planting would depend on socioeconomic status, or if mortality would depend on it.
Yeah, we were
and what you
talking
were thinking exactly when you took a look at this specific aspect of socioeconomic.
No, that's a great question. It was definitely a lot more of what I wanted to learn was how mortality was affected by the neighborhood. There's been some studies that have shown that people's involvement with their green space and people's commitment to protecting trees is definitely dependent upon socioeconomic factors or more demographic factors, maybe not just money, but and so I was curious to see if community involvement was potentially a driver behind this. And I obviously can't tease that out necessarily, but just in walking around the neighborhoods, in the wealthier neighborhoods, there were people who were like, are you studying our trees? Like, we want to protect our trees. Whereas when we were in some of the poorer neighborhoods, there were people who were like, yeah, this is in front of my son, I just don't like it. There were definitely, you could see, and there were neighborhoods in Back Bay, there's a lot of trees that are surrounded by fences that people have decided to put there personally. It's an added protective measure to their trees that we don't see in the poorer neighborhoods. And so I was just wondering if there was a relationship there. I wasn't really sure what I was expecting to find, but that was definitely the piece I was working
So
serious
maybe
about.
biomass C is not the metric you want
Right.
to use here. Maybe you want to look at like some other aspect of tree health, like wounding. I don't know, like what
Yeah,
else. I
no,
don't know
definitely.
if trees-
I think you're right. Yeah, we didn't have extensive information about wounding, so that's a little bit trickier. It's just that's a really qualitative thing that was hard to do in a large scale survey. But I think you're right. I think there still might be a story there, and we haven't quite given up on finding what that is yet. But you're right. It's not here.
To Tori's credit, she did look at many other things. She just included one figure here.
Yeah.
But the census, she looked at pretty much the suite of what's available in the census data, and in contrast to many other cities that have found environmental, social justice issues, there was
Which is
nothing.
actually a good
also
sign,
very
right?
interesting if you can show that for all your metrics.
Mhm.
That's cool.
Yeah.
So I have a couple of questions. First of all, going back to the previous question, how about like maybe causality runs the other direction, that nice trees make people's houses more
Absolutely.
valuable, and maybe like property values there
Yeah. No, I have
rather
no doubt.
than income.
We
Yeah.
looked at that,
Oh,
and
okay.
it's not there.
It's not there.
You would
Okay.
think, right? It seems like it's a pretty intuitive thing. But again, this isn't the trees on people's property as well. These are just, I mean, it does affect property value, but I think in that case, we
And so, for a policy person, are there big differences between the cost of these trees, like what it costs to buy them, what it costs to plant? Maybe carbon, kilograms of carbon per dollar of tree rather than anything else. If I want to like sequester carbon cheaply, should I be planting a certain type of tree, given its mortality? I don't know
Right.
whether
Yeah, no,
trees
definitely.
vary in cost and what it costs to take care of them.
They do vary in cost, yeah. And in terms of maintenance, I think that's pretty much, they haven't segregated that to tree species in the city, but there are different costs for these different trees. And I didn't do a cost benefit analysis, but there were several cities that have done that. New York especially has done that. And I don't remember extensively, but I do remember that they found that flat and estate portfolio was the most cost effective. But there are significant differences, and that does play a role into what trees are being planted for sure.
And then my last question is just idiosyncratic. When I walk my dog, I always wonder, tree lights, do they affect the growth of trees? Street lights right on top of trees.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Does that affect, and could you, since your trees are geospatially located, match that with street lights and see whether there's some systematic difference in growth rates with trees that are like right underneath street lights
Are you
versus
thinking?
not?
Are you thinking that the shade would?
No, I'm
So it's
thinking that
probably
the
the actual
light,
light.
like either like tricks them into keeping their leaves too long or putting them out too
Maybe,
early,
yeah.
or maybe they're able to use the radiation to actually get. If you can photosynthesize all day and all night,
Yeah.
maybe you've got an advantage. I don't know.
I'm a
but
little
I
bit
always
skeptical of
wonder.
that just because most of these trees are so open grown that like every other side of them feels whether it's dark or light. I'm
He wants you to go
instinctively.
back to all those.
He wants me to walk 70
Yeah.
kilometers.
I know.
No, that's the joy
It
of
would take just another few
latitude and longitude.
Yeah, no, if there is a database of it, it would be interesting to find out. I really have no idea, but I think that it's a good thought,
They're
yeah.
probably pruned differently, those
Probably.
individuals,
Mhm.
because if the city has a street light there, they
Yeah.
want the light.
Yeah, so maybe, I don't know, but it just seems like there's something weird going on,
Yeah.
at least in my neighborhood, with
Yeah.
like trees and understreet.
That's interesting. Have you actually seen things patterns?
My idiosyncratic view is the trees that are under street lamps in my neighborhood keep their leaves longer than the trees that don't. But that's just,
Yeah. that'd
you
be
talk
interesting to
about,
find out.
Something to look for.
Yeah,
this
for sure.
small case study.
Yeah. Who knows? Find out.
Have you given the presentation to the city of Austin Blackman, or to Charles Becker?
We talked to them briefly at the beginning of this project, but I haven't shown the results yet, no. I'm kind of waiting until I have everything finalized before I go to that step for the box model and everything, but, yeah, not yet.
I think they'll be
Well,
interested.
Yeah, we
we've,
definitely
they know that
hope
we
so.
were doing this, we talked to them when we were starting. We're still, there's a few kinks that we need to finish in this, and when we're done, we'll share it. I don't wanna share something and then find mistakes.
Right.
So we're not quite ready, but we will.
So I know that one of the drivers of plant competition is kind of light availability. They kind of shade each other out. And I mean, you mentioned that in cities, yeah, you're right, they have much larger crown areas. But there are also really tall buildings that tend to cast shadows for at least half the day. So, did you look at that at all? You know, like the orientation of the streets and how the buildings relatively cast shadows? And
Yeah,
stuff like
that's
that?
a good question. I didn't do that, but that would be something that could potentially be done just through like knowing where
Maybe
these
when you go
buildings
back
are.
and do the streetlight study, you could do that.
Yeah, just keep tacking it on people. It's great. Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting, and I had not thought about that yet, but it's true that definitely does affect.
Well, that's probably something you could do without ever, you know, leaving your pajamas.
Right. No, that's something that we've done.
Google Earth and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a
Yeah,
good thought. Thank
exactly.
you. Yeah.
This might be kind of a stupid question, but why did you only go on one side of the street?
Oh, sometimes we did both sides of the street, but what I meant was that the plot itself is just one side of the street,
Oh, okay.
just for like normalization of that. But yeah, sometimes we would be on both sides, depended. You obviously like there were some that were like giant intersections, and I didn't want to make my partner for the day sprint across a highway to get to places. Not that there were highways, but you know, it depended. I don't know the neighborhood. Yeah.
So out of curiosity, do you see a major difference in species distribution between neighborhoods?
Yeah, I looked at that a little bit. Generally, those 10 most common genera just happen to be the 10 most common in most neighborhoods, so I didn't see any huge differences. There were a couple like tiny differences, but overall, it seemed like it was. I mean, again, I didn't break it down to species level, you know, so maybe within that there is something to be found, but
Yeah, it's funny, like again, somehow my brain was going to like, you know, property prices and also like the fanciness of the types of trees that are coming out, right?
yeah, no, definitely. It's a good point. And I think there's definitely like street blocks where you'll see just entirely one species, you know, and so that plays out there. But I think these transects were pretty expansive, and so like I think we managed to catch a lot of variability within that. But you're right, that could have an impact on what's planted in different areas for sure. Yeah. Thanks.
The